All right, let's try this. Coming to you from the woods where I live. I'm a woodsman now. As you can see, I have a beard. We're going to talk about Wertheimer today. So Wertheimer's paper is on the exploitation of student athletes, specifically weather. So we're talking about exploitation. He says that exploitation is the appropriation of a surplus by the non-working class. Takes that definition from Marx. So that's when the people who are doing the labor don't make the lion's share of the revenue produced. That's when the capitalists take the money. So Marx wrote Capital and the Communist Manifesto, where he thought that it's wrong to take the money from other people's labor. So we can argue about that, but that's the definition that Wertheimer basically uses. The appropriation of a surplus by the non-working class, Marx's definition of exploitation. And so he asks, is that happening in college sports? Here's what he says about that. Well, in order to decide, you need to know what the university is gaining, university gains, and what the athletes are gaining, athlete gains. He says universities get money from college sports, sometimes, not always. So, of course, you have the NCAA tournament, where you have more than $1 billion exchanging hands every year. Sometimes college sports make money for colleges and universities. Sometimes they don't. Universities also get what he calls publicity. They get attention, right? You know about the profile of, let's say, Virginia Commonwealth University, VCU, because they went to the Final Four a couple years ago. So they get publicity, and therefore you know about who they are. And so that's a benefit they get. Sometimes they get recruitment. Sometimes athletes come to a university specifically because of the sports program, right? So Myron Rolle, for example, you might have heard of recently because he's fighting the COVID, was a Rhodes Scholar, just a brilliant all-around genius, but he went to Florida State to play football. He probably would have been an Ivy League kid if he had not gone to Florida State to play football. So they get recruitment sometimes. Athletes choose a school because of athletics. And then lastly, he says state pride. Sometimes we get a sense of pride from athletics in our state, like Ohio State University brings a sense of state pride to Ohioans, for example. So some of these are obviously dollar signs, and some of them are non-tangible benefits, like state pride, for example. Nonetheless, that's what the university gets. There's a lot of variability in there, of course, but that's what they get. On the athlete side, what do the athletes get? Well, they get education, right? Well, sometimes, right? Sometimes they go to really good schools that really do a great job of educating them, and sometimes that's not so true. So he says that is also sometimes, and he says you have to think of it as, the phrase here is ex ante or ex post, okay? Ex ante or ex post. Those are Latin phrases. Ex ante means before the action, and ex post means after the action. And what he's saying is, you need to evaluate the educational opportunity provided to student athletes ex ante. That is opportunity value, not outcome value. So an athlete can't say, for example, well, the university failed to educate me, and you can't say, well, okay, they're wrong for not educating you, when in fact the athlete never went to class, never read a book, never studied, never tried. That's not the university's fault. They provided you an opportunity, ex ante. You didn't take advantage of it, ex post. You didn't get the outcome you were hoping for because you didn't take advantage of it. So he says you have to think of the educational opportunity as ex ante. What's the opportunity given to the student athlete? Not ex post, what they actually got out of it, because of course sometimes they can blow it off. Now athletes get more than that. They also get coaching, which is better or worse, of course, depending on situation, context, circumstances. They get access to facilities, which is usually a nice benefit that other people don't have. And they get to play, right? That counts for something. Most of you wanted to keep playing beyond high school, and you didn't get to. Well, student athletes get to. And they also get publicity, much like universities get above. So they get some things, education, coaching, facilities, playing time, publicity, and the university gets their things. And the question is, of course, is this situation where you have appropriation of a surplus by the non-working class? Is it the university getting much, much more than the athlete is getting? Because if so, maybe we're talking about exploitation. So he asks the question, is that a fair bargain? Is it fairly negotiated, fairly struck deal? And Wertheimer doesn't think it is. He says there's a real problem here Because normally in contexts where we're talking about exchange, there's negotiation, right? When I go to buy a car, I have a price in mind. If I can't get the seller of the car to agree to my price, or if they can't match me in the middle, I walk away, right? I don't have to do it. I have other choices. I can look for a different car. But student athletes don't have alternative markets. Because of the situation with, for example, the NBA and the NFL, they're blocked from going directly to the competitive market. There's really only one path. There's really only one market for them. And scholarships are non-negotiable, right? They're capped by the NCAA at full tuition, room and board, and you can't get, by rule, anything more than that. So a student athlete cannot negotiate for more. They can't go to a different market, and they can't negotiate for more. So to say that it's a fair bargain, which is what Mark Emmert of the NCAA says, is to miss the fact that it's not a bargain at all. It's non-negotiable. So for Wertheimer, this is a real problem. This really suggests a dramatic asymmetry in terms of the power relationship between the student athlete and the university, because the student athlete is not allowed to negotiate. They're even forbidden from having an agent, for example. So that's a real problem for him. Now, the last thing of real importance, he says, he calls this mutually advantageous exploitation. So both sides are gaining, it's just that one's gaining a lot more than the other. He says on one account, the objective account, the only thing the student athlete is owed is that which they're promised. So if they were promised an education, room and board, and good coaching, that's all they're entitled to. Nothing more, nothing less. And if a university doesn't deliver, if they don't deliver on the education or the coaching or the room and board, then that's exploitation because they fell short of their promise. All the athlete is owed is an objective account of what they agreed to in the contract, in this case the scholarship or the agreement to come and play. But on a different account of exploitation, mutually advantageous exploitation, what they're owed is what's fair. So that's a difficult situation. Think about an analogy with professional sports. What about when an athlete outperforms their contract, right? So they're under contract, they make $500,000 a year, but they're really playing like a $5 million athlete. And so they feel like, well, yeah, I agreed to the contract for $500,000, but I'm playing like a $5 million athlete. It would really be fair if I got the money that I'm worth, not what I agreed to. And this is how contract disputes end up occurring. So the question is, what's the better account? Should an athlete only be entitled to that which they agreed to contractually, or should they get what they're worth in terms of a market system? Now, in either case in college sports, neither of those things are happening, according to Wertheimer's analysis. But that's a real difficult question, and actually he says in the paper, I'm quoting him almost verbatim here, he says, I do not think we are in a position to tell which is the better account, mutually advantageous exploitation, objective, or fairness. It's difficult to say which is a better account, ethically speaking. So there's some real problems here, right? You have a tremendous amount of gain in some cases by the university, athlete gains which are capped, at least in terms of financially. Notice there's no financial gain directly here. Now you have indirect financial gain through an athletic scholarship. That's assuming you get one, by the way. A tiny percentage of student athletes actually get a full ride, and a very small percent actually get a partial ride. Most student athletes are paying their own way. And again, for him, the lack of bargaining power is a real indicator that there's a high potential for exploitation here.